Donc le sujet de la...
So the topic of supply chains has already been discussed. We've talked about grains of sand and big blockages. We've talked about the Ukraine war, but that's one thing amongst many which explain why things are now sort of blocked. I've got 4 experts with me. Of course, you know Régis BROUDIN. He's chair of CESAM, but now he's the head of marine claims at AGCS. Hello again, Régis. Hello. Your neighbor is Catherine Lopez, your head of transport insurance at SANOFI. Yes. Sylvain MULLIEZ, your head of insurance for the BOLLORÉ group. As a reminder, BOLLORÉ is a logistics and flow organization expert, and you're organizing every link in the chain. Pascal TATIN, your ground expert and dangerous goods expert for the DGAC, the French Civil Aviation Agency. So you're aviation experts, and so we had a good split between previous panels, a good split between aviation and marine. But, well, talking about the supply chain, maybe, Régis, you could define exactly what we're talking about and explain the fact that now we're no longer talking about shipping. Those days are over. Well, they may not be over, but when talking about supply chain, indeed, more than ever, our business, marine, maritime, and transport, is better understood by the other branches in the insurance sector, and also better understood by our families, friends, and neighbors, and I'll come back to that. But the Ever Given was a strong moment in this understanding. So the idea that shipping is no longer just the right approach, from my perspective, as we saw with these various events in the last few years, people now are looking at container carrier transport with these sea giants from a logistical angle. The distance between what's separating land or sea or road with multimodal transport, what separates boats from the land no longer exists. The captain as sole master and commander is almost the stuff of legend. It's something from days gone by. And we saw that with the Ever Given. I usually say that if I use my experience in claims and marine policies, it's the first time that a marine event that did not include any tragedy on board. There was no loss of life for passengers, no hydrocarbon pollution was involved, but for the first time such an event got worldwide coverage from the press and the media and the mainstream media. So why? Because, quite simply, and here we're reaching the topic of the supply chain, it arrived at the same time as COVID. COVID had already blocked a large part of the planet for a year, and now it was not a sardine that was blocking the port of Marseille. It was a ship that blocked a major route in global trade. So here talking about billions of worth of global trade potentially blocked. When the event happened, over 360 even more ships were blocked at the entrance of the canal on both sides. So, of course, not just the goods that were on the Ever Given, 18,000 containers on board were blocked. Not just that, they were held back, could not be delivered. But there was also the backlog on the other ships that were blocked because of that incident. So that's when we really realized how fragile marine transport and shipping are. Not just fragile when marine events cause tragedies or pollution, but such shipping events can block part of the planet, be an obstacle to business. And if we're still talking about the Ever Given, we were all lucky that people could put the ship back in the water only 6 days after the event, mostly because of the spring tide. I remember very well that in the first few seconds, the first few minutes of that event, my role at Allianz was already to give my top management and my board very quickly a heads up of our commitments, because we could be involved on several aspects, as you know, the hull, the cargo, of course, but also for some of us, reassurance on the P&I, the international group of P&I. So in the first few hours, it was about assessing what would happen. And I really believed, I trusted the Egyptian authorities that the spring tide could help really get the ship back afloat. And that's what happened, but we were that close to a financial disaster related to disruptions or interruption in the supply chain that could have been much bigger, because if we could not get the ship afloat back quickly because of natural events, 18,000 containers on board, and the circumstances of the ship being stranded across the canal, we would have had to unload some of the containers with specialized cranes and so on. As you were saying, supply chain became a mainstream issue with COVID, with the Ever Given. Are there other events to keep in mind, maybe to really set the stage regarding these tensions? Well, yes, it has become mainstream, but that also echoes a lot of things that have been said since the beginning of this Perimat event. I think the Vinci representative yesterday was talking about the consumer aspect. Well, that's not the topic of our debate today, but everybody's impacted. Everybody realized with COVID and also with the Ever Given that, well, yes, when I'm ordering goods on the internet via e-commerce, I'm reliant on everything that's happening, and I suddenly realized that it's all very fragile. Other major events, much less mainstream, but that's a fact, that's how it is. When there's no pollution, when there's no tragedy on board, well, only the specialized, the trade press talks about that, and we thank them for that. But there were several events in the last few years connected to that, and that's one of the topics of this panel, related to the defense of this the gigantism, and also, as Uwe Schieder and Lars Lange said, the increase in the number of fires. We can come back to that if you want. The increase in the number of containers lost at sea that went overboard. And from my perspective, they are due to the same causes, as you were saying at the beginning, because of that sort of frenzy of e-commerce that has heightened after COVID, during or maybe even after COVID, with more and more internet orders. So container ships are under pressure. And here, as a shipping insurer who knows the issue with lorries and trucks, we've always known that the commercial pressure and regulatory changes on lorries, and so people are under, drivers are under pressure, so they drive too fast in roundabouts, they hit bridge piles, and so now there are more pressures on lorries and buses, and it's more complicated even than for sometimes ships. So let's look at the risks over the supply chain. Some of them you've mentioned. Catherine Lopez, what are the risks on your supply chain? For us, the major risks in this supply chain, which is driven by gigantism, and it's the consequence of this necessary gigantism and the necessary to focus and concentrate flows to optimize our transport. The first risk is concentration of flows in ports and airports. That could generate major losses of products, but also discontinuities and breaks in the supply chain with major patient impacts, because we deliver life-saving products, which means that we deliver products, and if products don't reach patients, then maybe their life could be at stake. And we're all patients. So this is the biggest challenge for us. But there are other major challenges added on top of that one that could have the same impact, i.e. Pandemic risk, because in periods of pandemic we had capacity issues. We have capacity issues on planes, on ships as well, issues of availability of ships in ports in Europe with blank sailing. We also had saturation in ports and airport networks in Asia with health and sanitary checks, with longer times on tarmacs, and also temperature excursions, which is the major risk in pharma, and also handling issues with broken crates. If you have syringes, if the syringe is cracked, you can no longer inject the product. So there was also sometimes a shortage of goods handlers in some areas, or lorry drivers in areas, and so there's also the natural disaster risk added on top of that pandemic risk because of climate change, the increase in temperatures, the number of events like earthquakes or hurricanes, and maybe in the future rising sea levels that could also have an impact. I would also name another two risks: war risk, geopolitical risk, which is increasing everywhere in the world, and we also need to deliver to countries at war, which is a challenge, an everyday challenge. We can see that now. And also cyber risk. And the world of shipping is very much exposed to cyber risk. We saw that yesterday with cyber, yes. Just for us to realize the volumes involved. At any given point or over a year, what are SANOFI's flows? Well, I could also only talk about export flows, because once they have reached their destination, other flows are going to be generated within a certain continent that could also be multimodal flows. Now I've estimated the volume of export flows, including from the US to Europe, and not just from Europe to the US or Asia or elsewhere, over 450,000 flows. Earlier you were talking about Paris Charles de Gaulle. What are the types of flows that go through a platform like CDG? I'm going to talk about pallets. Every year we have roughly 6,000 pallets import-export going around at any given point in time. That can mean a large number of pallets, between 190 to 200, that could be at the airport between import and export, and it could be exposed to a terrorist attack or a fire or what have you. Sylvain, MULLIEZ, for you, amongst the major risks for your supply chain, have you identified the same? Well, yes, we have the same issues because we are sort of a travel agency for packages. We'll transport parcels from A to B, we'll generate stops in the logistical phases, and we'll handle all the flows. The issue of accumulation exists, but that's not really the main issue for us. Now the issue is gigantism. So far, logistics experts thought like engineers. They thought about just in time. They didn't want any more inventory, and so bringing things just in time to any corner of the world. And then there was an extraordinary phenomenon with gigantism that started 20 years ago. You calculate the container ship capacity in boxes, and there were 6,000 boxes on a big ship, and then it went from 6 to 8, 12,000, and now we have 24,000 boxes on a ship. To give you an image, if you put all these boxes on a truck, it would take 12,000 lorries, and if you put these lorries one after the other, you could connect the Eiffel Tower to Lille in the north of France. So that's a huge system. The issue with gigantism is that there's no flexibility anymore in management. If you receive a boat with 24,000 boxes, only a few ports can do that. And if there's any problem at that port, the only thing that your ship can do is wait. That's really an issue. These big ships, that's also found In air transport with the Airbus A380, they are giants. They can receive a lot of goods, but if there's any problem, that's a grain of sand in the whole chain. And this gigantism is also found in handling, in Roissy or in other ports, and we have a system where the slightest grain of sand will cause huge problems. So the Ever Given is only one ship that went aground, but now 400 boats were blocked at the canal, and so now there are more and more grains of sand. With COVID, with the war in Ukraine, that's a major disruption for a lot of flows. What people may not be aware of in the restaurant business, we've talked about the post-COVID effect. A lot of people have changed jobs. In transport and handling, we have the same problem in developed countries. We've lost roughly 30% of handling capacity because handlers changed jobs. So everything is really tight and tense, and these are so many problems that logistics experts have to face when we need to put a stop to gigantism. That's our issue. You've talked about a record with 24,000 boxes. Is that the maximum we can reach? Are there projects to make ships even bigger, or is that rather decreasing? There are projects. We saw projects, a lot of you know about container catamarans with 36,000 boxes. But now it seems that ship owners are backtracking. A lot of ship owners that have very, very big ships, they realize that these very big ships are only viable for the Asia-Europe and Asia-US legs. That's the end where it stops. That's the only legs where they're useful. And so ship owners have revised their owners for big ships and went back to smaller ships with around 6,000 boxes, something that's more flexible. Amongst the grains of sand that you've discussed, I haven't heard about the blockages in Chinese ports, like Shanghai harbor. Is that an issue? Everybody's talked about Shanghai port. When the port of Shanghai was blocked, there was congestion everywhere in the world. And I think that it was in mid-April. We had every fifth container ship that was blocked in the US and LA. People hear about Africa. There are blockages in Africa, but also major blockages in Africa, in the US mostly, and in Shanghai. So the system was entirely blocked because the ships had to wait outside, and every fifth container ship was blocked outside a harbor. That was the record in April. Now, is that a bit better? Yes, a bit better. But if there's the slightest tension, now what we're worried about is industrial action. We have complicated health situations, rampant inflation. People are going to have a lot of problems feeding themselves. So what we're worried about is industrial action and strikes. There's the blockage on gas sites, and the port industry is going to face these problems inevitably. Pascal TATIN, what are the main risks with aviation, or the main risk? Well, indeed, that the main risk is accidents. We may not have the same problems as you with container ships. We had major accidents that were due to lithium batteries at some point. We could talk about the UPS 747 that crashed near Dubai, one from Asiana that crashed near Asia, because of big loads of big lithium batteries, not necessarily big loads, but small batteries that were stacked on the same pallets. And if one starts heating, it will contaminate all the others, and you'll have a mega disaster. So for us, the main risk is accidents, of course, especially because that can be in some undeclared or poorly declared or hidden dangerous goods. Normally, everybody's supposed to comply with the law. Everybody should offer an airline operator something that is well declared. For us, a DG package that is well declared, correctly labeled, is not worse than a customer suitcase that can contain a lot of very serious, dangerous goods. What we're the most worried about is undeclared dangerous goods, because that can be very painful if you're on an aircraft. Dangerous goods, we talked about that earlier, Régis, in container ships that can also trigger all the fires that we saw yesterday. Is that it for risk, or are there other concerns for you? Well, yes, there's this thing that we're worried about, as you were saying, incorrectly or falsely declared goods. We were used to that. Fires on ships is nothing new. But in the past, we were more used to the fact that fires would start in the engine room. But now we saw several cases, proven or suspected cases, of fires caused by dangerous goods, especially lithium batteries, but not only. And also, we'll remember what happened in March 2018, the Yantian Express in 2019. And that's not incorrectly declared goods, but more recently, there was this disaster with 4,000 Volkswagen vehicles that were discussed yesterday. But that's the issue of the electrification of the economy that is causing additional risk. And incorrectly declared goods, you can also have that phenomenon with another trend that we've noticed. I was talking about that earlier, containers overboard. In 2019, there was the MSC Zoe with 300 containers that went overboard. And in late 2019, early 2020, there was an exceptional series of 3 vessels on the same route between Japan and the western United States in the Pacific. Everybody can also think of rogue waves, and I'll come back to that later, but the Wanapus, Maersk SC, and Maersk Eindhoven that ended up in difficult sea conditions. But, I mean, that's nothing new either. Having difficult sea conditions, it's true that there are more and more difficult with climate change, but we can also see that amongst these events, issues were identified with incorrect declaration of goods. This time, not the content and nature of goods, but the weight of goods. And we also saw that beyond incorrect declarations, there's pressure from e-commerce, as I'm used to saying, that generates or even cause human error, incorrect declarations regarding container losses, problems with loading or poor lashing of containers. So there's a piling up of human error when you're under pressure, when you need to handle huge volumes. And coming back to climate phenomena, it's not just the climate phenomenon in itself, but if you add to that gigantism, the higher the stacks of containers, the more they can be caught by the wind. And if the cargo is too heavy, that compounds the problem. Any estimates of the number of containers lost at sea every year? Every year, not really, but recently the Zoe, that was 300 containers. And so these series of 3, that was over 3,000 containers.
So yes, that's about the figures. And at the beginning of the year, we had the Madrid Bridge with about 60 containers. It was in the Atlantic Ocean. So that's quite a broad issue. We've been talking about ESG, sustainable development, but obviously the mainstream media don't always cover these events. Containers that fall into the water, that's not great. And it's not the purpose of shipping either. So what are the possible solutions? What would you advocate to try and improve the situation? Sylvain? I'd like to say that currently, I may shock some people, but transport is of much better quality now. Look at the number of standards and international conventions, state regulations, and standards imposed by our customers. You have to have an approval for pharmaceutical goods, bulk transport, and all sorts of things. So we have to comply with a whole host of regulations. So transport is of better quality now. Where we're losing out a bit in quality is because of pressure. People don't abide by the regulations because they're under too much pressure. Second things, we supervise our subcontractors much more. We perform audits. We ask for greater quality of service. And I would even claim to say that we can currently find people who are specialists in transporting complicating things almost all over the place, like satellites or pharmaceutical goods. We find people who are really skilled. Also, in terms of data in the digital world, we can thus follow and track our merchandise better. We can track merchandise in real time, practically, wherever it may be. That's very useful for logistics experts, granted, but we have all sorts of sensors and IT systems which can detect light in a container. That means the container's been open, or the container has been banged or had a shock. We can deal with all this information in real time. We can inform the port authorities if there's a problem. So it's not always very easy. The main obstacle is the cost, of course. These systems are very costly. You have to build them, install them, and you have to take them back home and send them out again. We have to ensure that, for example, a sensor in a container, which is in the very bottom of the ship, is working well. We work a lot also on B, C, D plans. We have to be clever, nimble, anticipate situations. How are you going to manage a crisis? What other solution can you find? Catherine Lopez, what are the main challenges and actions? We have a number of major actions: contractual clauses, lessons to be learned based on analysis of claims, good practices, videos with key messages. E-learning will be obligatory, of course. I'd like to underscore two solutions which I view as very important. It's the way we deal with cyber risks, for example. With cyber risks, we convinced the supply chain. We discovered that IT teams with an external partner, depending on the size of these suppliers, could do a lot. They can assess the degree of cyber protection among suppliers who are going to be storing or processing our data. I explained to the IT department that data is very important, and products as well, throughout transport. And transport is very exposed to cyber risks. When there are global calls for tenders in terms of multimodal transport, air, road, and sea, we assess how mature cyber protection is amongst our suppliers. We explain the purpose and the challenge to them, and it's a win-win situation because we can really check on how good their cyber protection is and work together to improve exposure to the risk. So your teams reach out to the people? No, it's third parties. That makes partners feel more trusting and confident. The data is only shared with us in terms of defining improvements and potential risks in partners. Do you eliminate providers because they're not up to standard? The idea is not to eliminate, it's to onboard people to ensure their systems are really secure. It's a win-win situation, and that's what I call a win-win challenge. That's in terms of cybersecurity. The biggest project with a twofold facet is to identify the accumulation of concentrations of products, the concentration of value. There we have two solutions which round each other off. We have a solution with a partner where we insert devices which are not lithium-based. I can reassure you it's not dangerous. The battery works for a long, long time, and in real time we can trace things. These devices are linked to hubs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have 5 hubs around the world which receive our data. And in these hubs, you have very precise specifications. And in certain situations, you have warning issues and how you can ramp up warnings. With our quality security partners around the world, we can act on a risk in real time. Okay, it's not in the case of pure maritime shipping or transit, because it could be in a port, for example. Action be taken in real time in terms of the route, and in the air too. It's very effective with Brexit. There was a deviation of a route. There was a warning. The hub contacted English security officers, and they called the driver to see what was happening. Because of congestion, the build-up in trucks with Brexit, the driver switched on Waze to find a new route, and our products weren't blocked as a result. So this is a wonderful level of information. We can really manage risks in real time. The idea is to act in real time when there's a risk. That's the first aspect. Second aspect, which is more complicated to implement, risk scoring in ports and airports. Identify concentrations of goods, score the risk, rank it. Once we've identified this with a tool which we developed with our insurers, we identify major strategic flows and the number of claims. The aim at a given port at a given point in time is to score the risk owing to a build-up, a concentration of products, taking account of external parameters like the risk of natural disaster in the port or the airport area, and geopolitical risk as well. We score the risk in terms of these major dangers, the idea being to rethink the flow, redesign it, comparing the cost of the redesign and the limiting of the risk. Will define a minimum amount of risk that's acceptable, beyond which there will be a surplus cost because of redesigning to avoid the risk. You have this excess cost versus the potential major loss. Should you wait for an accident to occur before putting on your safety belt, or should you put on your safety belt to avoid the accident? I say once is more than enough. I'd like to talk about the preceding example you gave. You talked about a warning system. The hub, which gets all the information, will warn you if a pallet is too exposed to heat, for example. Yes, and what does that enable you to do? You can call the quality officer who can act in real time in the area where the warning has been triggered. And does this happen often? Is this kind of warning very useful? Is the hub constantly issuing warnings? Well, since we developed this solution, I talked to you about Brexit. We had some problems of temperature, and we could deviate the flow because sometimes the truck isn't working properly, the lorry, and that could generate high losses. In certain deviations, what counts is the intensity of the temperature and the length of this very high temperature. So the temperature was very high, the duration was very short, so we knew that the product would be intact. And when the product is not intact, then we stop it in its tracks, so to speak. So there's several virtues. Are these solutions fully rolled out? Yes, when it comes to strategic flows. And a strategic flow for us is a flow for Ukraine and Russia, because as our flows to Ukraine and Russia, they're tracked and traced with a warning system. Pascal TATIN, what for you are these solutions? We quickly talked about risks in the hold. What solutions are there for aviation? We have two major thrusts, prevention and information and training and detection. When it comes to training, I think it's the same in shipping. All the players in air transport should be trained about the transport of dangerous goods. The forwarder, the packager, people in the airport, everybody needs to be trained. IATA started with this, and we have a new training mode which will be based on the skills and functions of personnel instead of their official titles. We want various positions to be properly recognized, and this will apply as of 1st January 2023. Prevention, ICAO, because I represent France on the dangerous goods panel at ICAO, we've laid down standards and mitigation measures which are quite important in addition to separating dangerous goods. For example, lithium has to be systematically separated from everything that's flammable to avoid overheating and other major problems. We're not going to talk about radioactive goods. Same thing applies there. All these mitigation measures are quite important. The idea is to reduce the risk on a plane. Reduce the risk. Why? Because if a fire breaks out or there's an explosion on an aircraft, you have to act, but you're in the air. And it's more complicated than when you're on a boat, I presume. The major problem, the major risk with lithium is that if there's overheating of a lithium battery, you can't use just a normal fire extinguisher to put out that kind of fire. It doesn't work. To put out a lithium fire, you have to cool it and you have to add water, so you don't have a lot of water on a plane. So we try to separate the merchandise and protect it better so that if there is an incident, you can reach an airport quickly enough to settle the problem on the ground rather than in flight. The second thrust is safety and security. Security is there to detect explosives, and only explosives. That's the European standard laid down by the European Commission, detecting explosives to avoid terrorist acts. That's a very good thing per se. We would like security to detect dangerous goods in parcels or in passenger luggage, so we can avoid this kind of incident. Detect, prevention, training, these are the main thrusts which we have currently worked on. You talk a lot about training. What about recruitment? Are there problems with recruitment? Will recruitment become a bit different in the supply chain over the coming years? Stéphane. Well, as I said to you earlier on, logistics experts are really engineers now, or they certainly used to be. They worked on transport from A to B. What I've said today is that we manage too many risks. There are too many mishaps, and this really hits us hard. The risk dimension will become a major component in logistics. You can't calculate zero inventory. I have to manage things as best I can. Someone said to us, and that was an intelligent comment, he said the shortest route may not be the best. It may not be the most reliable one. So logistics experts will have to incorporate these risks increasingly and foresee B plans, C plans. We consider that logistics experts will become real risk managers. They will have to anticipate. So obviously this will make that profession evolve and change. And then we have IT as well. We have become very virtual in many fields, and I think increasingly we'll have to have people who know a lot about IT and data collection. It's fine to collect data, but you have to be able to study and process it too. And these are two big changes when it comes to logistics. Régis, BROUDIN, you were listening and seemingly approving what was said about profiles. I was thinking about another thing. As said by Sylvain, we have the impact of COVID and sometimes a lack of human resources. Look at what's happening in the States currently. You may have read this in the press. It's very difficult to find lorry drivers. And we've observed this trend. Recently, there was a claim involving a lorry accident. The driver was 19 years old. It's not that age is a problem per se. But in any event, we know that in these professions, experience, hours of flight or driving are really important. And then you have the issue of crews on board. For the same reason. Or we know that Russian, Ukrainian crews are often the bulk of crews around the world. And you have to look carefully at their qualifications. In our statistics pertaining to claims, and I referred to that earlier on, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen ever worse events occurring more frequently. There are more serious events because of the gigantic size of things. When you have a container ship which burns, as mentioned yesterday, it's difficult to identify the starting point of the fire, and it's difficult to put it out. The crew members can't do it. We saw this increasingly. That was the case of MULLIEZ. The teams, the crews have to leave the ship immediately because a ship is like a high-rise building. It's so big. And you have to adopt a property approach, an assets approach to these huge vessels, and it's our damages departments that need to onboard that. Imagine you have 20 crew members on a 15 million ton ship. It's like a high-rise building. And say you have Smith that intervenes, they're going to take longer to put out the fire. It requires more means. And where do you take refuge? Which port? The size of the ships has grown ever bigger. And this has not been matched with an increase in the size of the ports. Efforts have been made to get deeper ports and access routes to the ports, make it easier for the crews, but the ports haven't really changed that much. So this ship had to go to the United Arab Emirates to find a port of shelter. The fire lasted for longer, assistance costs escalated. So we're talking about contributing 15 to 20%, and increasingly we're now talking about 50% in terms of exposure. That's why things are getting worse. And now also the common claims. You may recall the general average. That was something we could just smooth out in our statistics. But now this is become very frequent. And some of our customers, our preferred insured parties, are involved in 2, 3, 4 cases of general average. And that really has to change our approach. Having said this, as others said since yesterday, the idea is not to ban or exclude people, but to accompany them, help them. We must focus more on prevention. As I was saying at the beginning of the round table, we have to look at the logistics of shipping more. We have to give support to our customers and our cargo customers and our freight forwarders too. The idea being to give assistance through our maritime engineers. The idea is to work on how best to define the shipping, the transport at each stage, define procedures when it comes to loading, together with the freight forwarder. The idea is to have guarantees in terms of the quality of the ship, the mode of transport, safety measures for the merchandise, the whole shipping plan, including moving merchandise from one ship to another. The idea is that insofar as possible, we have to separate the shipping of large units into smaller units to limit risk. Look at the case in Shanghai Port, for example. I may be a bit provocative now, but perhaps we need to analyze transport costs, change our approach in that respect. The least costly choice may not be the best one. If you look at our container ships, which are like cathedrals, when you're higher up on the stack of containers, it costs less as opposed to when you're lower down. But when you're lower down, you're perhaps safer also when you're in the hold. So you have to look at the whole set of costs. What I'm trying to say is that we must all work together, brokers, insurers, cargo insurers, transport officers, in our daily business activities, or like in forums like today and with Parimat. We all work ever more closely together, the aim being to foster this exchange of information amongst all those in the transport ecosystem. You don't ban, you encourage people, therefore. You encourage people to use smaller vessels, for example? Well, insofar as possible, but we haven't banned things, and these big ships have developed increasingly. It's an absolute evil. We've all been part of this system. It's part of globalization. We're talking about economies of scale. There's one single ship, but a greater merchandise with greater value on board. We thought this might be more environmentally friendly. There'd be fewer ships on the seas. So you have to adapt. It's not that we weren't hopeless in the past. You learn as you go. But you have to look at the supply chain as a whole. Lithium batteries, for example. We know full well that these lithium batteries are used in some of our preferred objects, tablets, smartphones, electric bicycles, computers. 80% of the batteries are produced in China. That means we heavily depend on these batteries, which then have to be shipped if we want to enjoy all our devices. So I'm talking about the very near future. Sylvain, do you want to talk about the size of vessels? Yes, the word cathedral is a very apposite one. It's incredibly true. These create unmanageable claims. I therefore think it's necessary to scale down, to make things smaller, and ship owners have understood this. Apart from the major lines where you use a huge ship, I think people will revert to a smaller vessel. It's more worthwhile economically speaking. Something has happened in the meantime. You had boats with 3,000 boxes, 6,000, and ever since the number of boxes have increased. And now you have ship owners on small lines with huge boats, and they only need to transport 3,000 boxes, so it's no longer economically viable. So ship owners are beginning to scale back down and use smaller boats, and that suits us just fine. There's another issue, which has totally destroyed logistics for a year and a half. There were no containers. There were no containers for a very good reason. The ship owners at the beginning of the pandemic thought the crisis would be very long. So a container is usually scrapped every 10 years, and ship owners said, well, we'll scrap the containers. They're only 8 years old, and we'll start to replace them later. Second thing, the container lines stopped in China because of COVID. Third problem, big ships were being made instead of small ones. Instead of having a direct line from Shanghai to Dunkirk, people said, well, go from Shanghai to Le Havre in a huge boat and from Le Havre to Dunkirk in a little one. But there you have to manage empty containers. In other words, there's no country in the world which needs as many containers for import as for export. In the U.S., when you import 10 full containers, only 2 are shipped back off, so 8 remain empty. And these 8 empty ones have to be sent back to Asia. That's a very complicated job. It's particularly complicated when you have big ships. You multiply the feeders, you multiply the means of transport, and you end up with a disaster. These empty containers are beginning to be absorbed now, but this really penalized things. The price of containers went crazy because there was a lack in Africa, for example. There weren't enough containers. Ship owners put them on the Trans-Pacific lines instead of the Africa lines, for example, and everyone was penalized, and we still are today. Cocoa, for example, there are no containers available to ship the cocoa. It's now being shipped on pallets, which is not very customary. So small boats are back, and I think that will make the system far more fluid when it comes to going from one port to another or changing ports if one is blocked. That's hard to do with a big ship. It's much easier with a smaller one to take refuge in a smaller port next door, rather than just sitting around and waiting for free space in the port. We've nearly reached the end of our discussion. I wanted to ask you if you had a wish. If you had a genie with a lamp and he gives you a wish, okay, the elections are now over, but we could perhaps use this momentum. What would you wish for? That there be no air transport accidents. That would be my main wish. And that's what all players in the airline world would wish for. And I hope that aircraft will enable us to transport the volumes we have to transport because of the war in Ukraine. We lost the Cathedral of the Air, the Antonov and 224 and others. We don't have these big planes anymore, planes which could fly with Ukrainian or Russian crews. That's my wish. I hope we'll be able to transport everything we need to and find alternative solutions like the Beluga. You probably heard about that. We're lending it a second life, giving it a second lease on life with a view to transporting big volumes. What about you? What wishes might you have? Well, I think we should go back to fundamentals. I love maritime law, and I was always taught that maritime law gave rise to the first rules on liability and responsibility. We can never contend with the sea. Okay, we never know whether a ship will really reach its destination. Logistics experts, however, are sure of what's going to happen. People are sure that each year there will be 100% return. I believe that logistics experts, people in industry, have to understand that transport is of necessity dangerous. And maritime insurers must realize that shipping is dangerous, and we have to factor that into our line of thinking. If there is a problem, we may not be able to manage it. Catherine? Well, the magic lamp, there are actually 3 wishes you're usually allowed. My first wish is that there should be departments to protect people in companies, human resources departments. We in SANOFI, we have a supply chain department with a team which takes action on risk around the world on a daily basis, because there are risks every day. That's my first wish. Second wish, we must work together on risks, because together we'll be much stronger, we'll go further, and we'll find more solutions. My last wish is that the patient be satisfied. Régis, this will be the final conclusion. As I said, my wish would be prevention. That's nothing new. Sylvain is quite right. We shouldn't think that things are certain and definite. There are unforeseeable events. As insurers, we have to focus on prevention, however. And as Catherine has said, I think we should work more closely amongst all players, including insurers, brokers, insured parties, transport officers. We should work more closely together. My third wish, this often crops up as a topic. Thanks to all these efforts and joint work, I hope that one day we'll be able more easily to trace the merchandise on board ships or wherever they may be around the world. This is the ardent wish of all my colleagues on the market. And when it comes to compensation, when a shipping event occurs, it's much easier if we know exactly what is involved and who is involved in terms of the hull insurance. Now, when it comes to containers, things are working better. Granted, we're very proactive, but we need to have closer partnerships with brokers. We need to have easier contact so that we know whether the insured parties have an interest or some goods or merchandise on board. We need to swap information more, but we're a far cry from having mastered the issue of where exactly our assets are located in real time. Thank you very much to all four of you. Thank you to all the participants.